So as I was sitting here today hearing various presentations, I was at first a little concerned that, well, what would we have left to say by the end of this time? The good news is that although my slides are at a fairly high level of generalization, everyone else has given you some really good specific examples and data or facts of the things. So if you've all paid attention all day, I might occasionally refer to, oh, well, so-and-so said that, or so-and-so's slide. So I couldn't have planned it better. So thank you for that. So my theme is to talk about sharing promising practices. So the topic is to look at employment programs and income security policies or supports in Canada, and how they interact or don't interact, and how they can contribute to work integration, return to work, or work reintegration for individuals with disabilities. I'm going to briefly talk to three questions, which I was asked to talk about. So this was my mandate letter I received from the organizers. One was to look internationally at trends, particularly in OECD countries, on this question of what's been going on in the last decade or so with respect to income support programs and employment services targeted at citizens with disabilities in various other countries. A really big second question was, how does Canada then perform? How do we stack up or compare in relationship to what we might call the innovative trends, the promising practices that we could identify elsewhere? And then third question is, what next? This mapping the road for an agenda for change. What next for more open or more inclusive employment opportunities and for greater labor force participation for Canadians with disabilities? I mean, any one of those questions is a PhD, I suppose. So the next slide, I want to just here flag, again, very quickly, 5 different international trends that I think are noteworthy for this topic. Some are, I think, in evidence much more with respect to what's being called the work injury system. So in other countries where there are vocational rehab and workers' compensation or accident insurance programs, in particularly European countries and the United States and other OECD countries, some of these trends are more evident in those kinds of systems. Some of them are also evident in social security or income maintenance programs, where these trends are beginning to happen. Some of them might be in social insurance programs, others more in the area of social assistance. But again, you've heard these themes today already, but reforming the assessment processes of programs to focus more on people's capacities rather than their impairments or their deficits. A major notable trend, again, lacking in Canada more than in other countries, is recognition of partial capacity to work and to return to work. In Canada and the United States as well, many of our programs are more on the income side, or more on a binary. You're either employable or you're unemployable. You either can work or you can't work. And if you can't work, then you may be eligible for the benefit. And if you can work, then you're probably, by definition, ineligible for many income support programs. Another trend, of course, worldwide is more to focus on work incentives. That could be either in the form of financial supports to employees and or financial supports to the employers, and other kinds of means of assisting people with disabilities to return to work. I won't go into all these. Some of the other ones are more notable that Canada's trying to catch up on, is establishing employer forums, and also the introduction. I think Wolfgang will probably speak to this and can speak to this with much more authority than I can, but the whole movement towards disability management. And again, the developments internationally are very promising in sickness absence monitoring or return to work programs and protocols. We've got a lot we can learn from in other countries in that regard. The next slide looks at Canada briefly in terms of promising practices that one can observe here. And I've just selected a bundle here. First one is the category around provincial social assistance. As John Stapleton pointed out earlier today, the welfareization of income support is quite striking in the country. I think back to when the Canada Assistance Plan was, well, I'll even go back further. In the 1940s, when Leonard Marsh and others developed the blueprint for modern social security in this country, one of the major assumptions was that you brought in things like family allowance or a universal child benefit, you brought in unemployment insurance, you brought in investments in public infrastructure and employment supports so that you did not need to have a large social assistance system to provide basic income support to Canadians. They would get those kinds of income supports and employment opportunities in other kinds of programs. They would be stunned if they were still alive today to see the reliance we still have. The founders of the Canada Assistance Program in 1966 would be stunned. Dick Splain, the great Richard Splain, just passed away the other day, a former public servant in the Government of Canada, one of the chief architects for the Canada Assistance Plan. I think he was troubled in his later years to see the continued reliance we do on this so-called last resort program in our country. Anyways, we still have it. It's going to be around a long time. In my own province, I can tell you we've done some interesting things recently. Our earnings exemption is now $9,600 a year without affecting a penny of your social assistance. That's $800 a month per person with disability. The other day was announced, which will take effect in December 1st of this year, any inheritances you get will not affect your disability social assistance. Any gifts you receive do not affect your social assistance. Any education and training allowances you receive will be totally exempt. Any bursaries and scholarships you may receive as you're going to school are now completely exempt for those people with disabilities on social assistance in British Columbia. I hope it doesn't take 10 or 15 years for the other 9 provinces to do those things. They don't cost a lot of money to the Treasury of any provincial government. They send an important signal, though. We've also raised our asset level to $100,000 from $8,000 a year. If a couple is on disability assistance, it's $200,000 a year for assets. As Sherry Torgnan said, why have we, for 100 years, stripped the assets of some of the most vulnerable, marginalized people in this country? It's outrageous. I applaud my funny little government. We call them Liberals in BC. They're not really Liberals, but the BC Liberal government is doing some smart things, the right things, the good things to do, and they send a signal. Those are promising practices. Work opportunities for people with disabilities. You see them on the slide. I want to talk just briefly about employer incentives and supports. The first bullet under here is wage subsidies. Now, both Mark Wafer and Mayor Bradley remarked on these, and with some fair critical remarks. There is evidence, though, certainly in some countries, in Europe in particular, where if wage subsidies are targeted, particularly to those groups who are severely disabled and incredibly marginalized, they do work. They can have positive outcomes. They're not a panacea. I'm more inclined to look towards things like direct grants or corporate income tax deductions. I think we do have to be frank and honest that some accommodations, if we still use that word, are expensive. They're not all small, they're not all cheap, they're not all one time. We need to acknowledge that there are some real business costs to making some fundamental adaptations or adjustments in our workplaces. Next slide. Some of the ongoing challenges. There are promising practices in Canada across the country, but too often they're just small pockets of innovation that we can find in particular programs and in particular jurisdictions. The challenge is how to scale those up and how to share them across the country more broadly. I guess that's another definition of how do we work towards coordination or harmonization. Sherry Torgnan presented this morning on the slide on, particularly during the Harper years, 2006 to 2015, around disability. I would characterize and even before them, and even in the mandate letters of Mr. Trudeau's new ministers, modest investments in employment supports by the Government of Canada. We have the Opportunities Fund for Persons with Disabilities. We have the Enhancing Accessibility Fund that was started by Jim Flaherty, which is now an established program. Incidentally, in that fund, you can get up to $50,000 if you're an employer to make capital cost adjustments. Hardly anyone knows about it. It's a unique feature. CPP Disability Vocational Rehabilitation Program is still a very modest. The one that troubles me the most, though, is the labor market agreement for persons with disabilities. It's not mentioned in any of the mandate letters, although other labor market agreements are. It's basically been frozen for about 10, even longer now, 15 years in real terms. There's been no real new money invested in that federal-provincial agreement. The only last remaining agreement targeted specifically to Canadians with disabilities around work. I wait to see what the new government in Ottawa will do in terms of implementing an implementation plan for the UN Convention on the Rights for Persons with Disabilities and see what their commitment is to monitoring that through the Canadian Human Rights Commission. That's an opportunity. We heard Isaac and others discussed about the unmet needs. On average, about 30% of employed persons with disabilities have unmet needs. If you're unemployed, it's way higher than that. We still have a lot of people who require basic assistive aids and devices. Alec Farquhar made, I think, an eloquent comment on that earlier today, too, around these kind of needs. So those are some of the challenges. Let me end with a couple of slides on action or outcomes, possibilities for progressive change, and positive policy reform. And these are just for the purpose of this presentation. We could have, one is to continue the task of modernizing income assistance in Canada, what John Stapleton focused on so much and so well in his presentation. There's so much more work we can do. And a lot of the changes are not big dollar items. Yes, we need to raise the rates. I'm in a province where we've not raised the rates since 2007. It's $906 a month. That's much higher than it is in Atlantic Canada, but in one of the most expensive places to live in the country, British Columbia, it's woefully inadequate. We need to invest more in the supports for transitions to employment, including for those persons with partial capacity. We need to transform that sector of nonprofits, local service employment agencies, and we need to move off sheltered workshops. And I was glad to hear that mentioned earlier today. I understand that here in Ontario, that's back on the political agenda and on the ministers' minds very much. As Michael Bach was quoted in the newspapers the other day, we've been talking about this for 45 years. It's a difficult issue. In my own province, I'm on the board of Inclusion BC with 70 member groups. Half of them run sheltered workshops. We talk about full citizenship, access, rights, and inclusion, and in our own membership, we have these challenges. We need to figure out how to transform that sector. And we need, again, just for the federal officials in the room, there's a wonderful program that's been around for years under the Western Economic Diversification Office called Entrepreneurs with Disabilities Program. It's not a big program. It's about $5 or $7 million a year, targeted in the 4 Western provinces. For the life of me, I don't know why it's never been extended to the other regions of the country. It's a specific program to provide low interest or grants to start businesses, small businesses, and to launch into self-employment opportunities. That could be scaled across the country quite easily at a cost of no more than $50 or $60 million total. Some others just quickly. This is my last slide, I promise. At the federal level, we should look at the EI sickness benefit program and look at CPP disability programs and consider how to be more effective at early diagnosis and early intervention services. Rather than having for like CPP disability a 4-month waiting period and then an application process that can take another several months, and then if you're rejected in the first instance, it can go on and on. We need to act faster and better as to who these people are applying. People may not know that the rejection rate for CPP disability is about 50%. It's one of the highest in the world. That tells you 2 or 3 different things. One is we're not doing a very good job in explaining to Canadians who is and who isn't eligible for that. That's almost every year, 45 to 50% rejected. I realize it's a first payer program. So what is happening is a lot of other programs, this is a form of perverse coordination. All the other programs refer people and shovel them towards CPPD. And 1 out of every 2 And I know people are referring them knowing they know that person's going to get rejected. So there's a lot of disingenuous support being given and advice that is just untrue. There are lies being told to Canadians about these programs. I'm sorry to call it that, but that's what it feels like. The last point is around workplace cultures. People have talked about this a lot today. Attitudes of employers and employees. The role of co-workers is important. Someone eloquently talked about invisible disabilities a few moments ago, and that's a real concern. We need to have more open and honest conversations in this country about why do employers refuse requests from employees with disabilities for reasonable accommodation? Why are so many employees afraid to ask for accommodation? And we need to finally, I'm a big fan of carrots rather than sticks, so I would like to see us expand the range of incentives and supports to truly recognize the costs, whether it's small businesses, medium, or nonprofits, for the cost of accommodation and adaptation until we get better language, and ultimately to move towards universal design. Thank you.